We're going to get to Bayern. We're going to talk about their really good win over VfB Stuttgart. But we want to start with Leverkusen and Frankfurt first. You said it would be a 3-2 Leverkusen win. I said a high-scoring draw. I feel like I got robbed of my prediction by the referee in the final minutes. But you predicted a Leverkusen win. That's now, 12 in a row that Frankfurt have lost in Leverkusen. But Stefan, I actually kind of felt that this time around, Frankfurt really didn't deserve to lose this game.
Yeah, maybe. I think to a certain degree, I'd probably agree with you. To a certain degree, I'd probably disagree, just because it felt to me like a game in which Frankfurt had control of it and then lost it. To be perfectly honest with you, after Leverkusen had managed to kind of potentially pull ahead with a penalty, which, as we discussed in real time on the chat, was very lenient from the referee. But then Victor Boniface misses that penalty. 2 or 3 minutes later, Frankfurt get their own relatively lenient penalty, although, as I said in chat, I think it was probably more justified than the Leverkusen one. And then Marmoush obviously scores from it. At that point, this game was Frankfurt's match wrapped up, because Leverkusen not only had that kind of morale blow from missing the penalty, but then obviously Frankfurt went ahead and scored. And at that point, I feel like Frankfurt should have had this game locked up. They could sit deep, they could counter-attack. It fell completely into their wheelhouse, their tactics. And it just didn't really happen that way. If you kind of look at the XG for the game, Leverkusen's XG was 4.07 to Frankfurt's 1.55. And if you kind of look at the way that the XG kind of played out, Frankfurt's XG didn't increase from the 24th minute until the 90th minute, when they had a chance, a real kind of credible chance to score. And it just kind of felt to me like Frankfurt, quite surprised that they scored. And then it was almost like in the back of their minds, this kind of idea like, oh my God, we actually never win at the Bayern Arena. This is crazy. And then when Leverkusen scored, and then I thought they actually finished the half probably the stronger team, you could almost feel like the occasion was just getting to Frankfurt as the game went on and on and on. And then Leverkusen did what Leverkusen do. They're obviously able to bring on Florian Wirtz. He was a complete torment. And then obviously he sets up Boniface to finally get his goal in the 72nd minute, I think it was, the 71st minute. So you're absolutely right. It's a game in which Frankfurt could have potentially got a penalty in the last minute. It was a really weird call from the referee to not give it, considering what he had given in that game. And I'm sure we can talk about that. But I don't know. I just feel like this is an opportunity missed from Frankfurt, to be perfectly honest with you. Leverkusen have been pretty poor so far this season. Florian Wirtz didn't come on until like the 60th minute or something like that. And yet they just kind of gifted, I think, 3 points to Leverkusen in this game.
Yeah. I just looked up the XG, and it's a mind-blowing 4.29 to 1.21, and that includes the Frankfurt penalty, right? So that's a 0.7 or 0.75. If I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, based on that, Leverkusen were in control. The eventual Boniface winner, Kevin Trapp, you could see that he was still rusty, right? He goes out there and kind of, I know it gets deflected, but he kind of goes out there with his foot rather than with his hands. Every goalkeeper coach will always tell you, use your hands. There's a reason why we are able to use our hands as goalkeepers, and that we should really use that extra 2 sets of tools that we have over every player, whenever we can. So I thought that was a little bit awkward, but maybe also, he's been out with an injury, and so not maybe quite as sharp as he needed to be. That happens. And I do think the 2 penalty calls at the very start of the match, well, it's really just the first one, right? Which I thought was extremely soft as well. I do think then it's hilarious that they go out to VAR, and we can talk about VAR all day, and I think most people are probably going to be pretty bored about it. But, he goes out to VAR to double check it, Kirchner does, and the issue I have here is that I think it's a very soft penalty, but I don't think it's one that you should overturn, and they didn't, right? But if you don't think you're going to overturn it, then don't go out and look and waste everyone's time for 5 minutes. And then the other thing is, like, the problem is if you are calling this penalty, which I personally think you can't overturn, but the moment you call that penalty, that is the benchmark you're setting for the rest of the game. And he's stuck with it for the second penalty. But based on those two penalties that were quite soft, I think the Ekitike one is a penalty too, because, you know, at the end of the day, if you as a referee, you know, it's so critical, I think, for the players on the field to know what they're up against, right? And if the referee from the first minute on says, okay, this is the line I'm going to walk, and I'm going to walk it for the full 90 minutes, then of course, yeah, you can disagree with that line, but at least it's consistent. I think the worst thing that you can see in a game is inconsistency, and then that also leaves the refereeing team, you know, around Brich in huge, gives everyone a platform to attack the refereeing team, right? And I think rightfully so, Markus Krösche had some really harsh words to Kirchner, the head of refereeing in German football, about this. I need to correct myself. It was Brich, of course, who was on the field. And I think Krösche is right, Markus Krösche, the sporting director of Eintracht Frankfurt, to say, like, look, you know, at the end of the day, we need to know what to expect. And I think rather than talking about this Leverkusen win or for how what the Frankfurt faults are, we're talking about the refereeing decision here. And I think it's tiring at some point. And I do think the final decision there on Tar, like he gets underneath Ekitike, and who knows what happens if he doesn't push there. I think that's, Stefan, I think based on what we've seen earlier, that's a penalty.
Yeah. I mean, it's that kind of age-old thing. If it happened in the middle of the pitch, it would be a foul. No one would even think twice about it. It was a complete, like, brain fart from Lucas Herdecki, and in a sense, it was almost a kind of microcosm of what's going on for Leverkusen's defence this season. And this is something we did predict, and it's something we talked about last season. We said Herdecki last year had this superhuman campaign, and he was always going to come back down to earth. And it's not the first time already we've seen this season where he's had kind of moments where he hasn't made the save that he would have made last year. And for anyone who didn't watch the game, basically in the last minute of the game, a ball goes over the top. Hugo Ekitike, the Frankfurt forwards, chased it down with Jonathan Tah. Herdecki comes out to clear it. He clears the ball by punting it off the chest of Jonathan Tah, who's about 3 feet in front of him. Ball lopes over the top of him, and then it's just basically scramble to the Leverkusen box to try and Leverkusen goal line to try and tap it in. Hugo Ekitike, it has a bit of backspin on it as well, which I think doesn't help. Basically, Ekitike and Jonathan Tah basically in this foot race to try and get to the ball first. They both leap for the ball. Hugo Ekitike higher than Tah, and Tah obviously just leans into him to make sure Hugo Ekitike can head the ball home. In real time, I did think maybe the referee was looking at that thinking, well, Hugo Ekitike was never actually getting the ball, but of course that shouldn't really matter. It was basically intent of Jonathan Tah, which is the problem here. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I thought it was a penalty at the time. I think it was a ridiculous move. Been looking at the German press today, it's all discussion about it. And yeah, I think Frankfurt should be aggrieved. Having said that, I don't really think we should use this as an excuse to let them off with this. I still think they were pretty poor in this game. I thought Leverkusen actually did a really good job of actually neutralising Marmoush and Ekitike in the way that they just completely dominated teams this season with this incredible pace over the top, and both them running through. And obviously, Leverkusen have two very fast fullbacks in Grimaldo and Frimpong, who I thought both did quite well to cover for both those players. And like, this is a game in which finished with Robert Andrich finishing with more shots than Marmoush and Ekitike, you know, and so and more goals than obviously Ekitike himself. So I thought this was always going to be a real test of what Leverkusen could do without Florian Wirtz, and I actually thought they did a pretty decent job of it in the first half. We've been kind of waiting for Martin Terrier to kind of step up. I thought he was a bit better. He obviously had the final touch for the assist, set up Robert Andrich for that goal, the equaliser. And it kind of felt more like kind of classic Leverkusen, to be honest with you, where maybe they didn't start tremendously well, but they definitely finished very strongly. Yes, Frankfurt technically should have had a penalty in the last minute and maybe grabbed an equaliser, and you could probably say, well, that's like old Leverkusen. Yeah, it's a fair point. But I think on the balance of play in terms of the actual what was actually taking place in open play, this felt like a game that went Leverkusen's way. It's a game in which Leverkusen exerted their dominance. It's a game in which they exerted their tactics. And I was really quite surprised at how kind of poor Frankfurt were, considering what we saw from them against Bayern Munich before the international break, where they really took the game to Bayern. And in this game, it felt like they were always quite content with a point. They scored that opening goal and they thought, right, that's it. We don't have to do anything now. And then, of course, Leverkusen just kind of grew in strength and strength and strength. And Frankfurt just didn't have anything to respond to with that. So,
yeah,
I don't know. I thought going into the game, and we talked about this in the previous show, like Top Muller was kind of mouthing off after the Bayern game, saying, oh, I'm quite annoyed we didn't take all 3 points from Bayern Munich, which is, of course, a very bombastic kind of thing to say. But there's no point saying things like that if you can't then go to Leverkusen and do the same thing, So I think he'll be probably pretty pissed off at his team's performance in that game, even if he's quite content just spending the next week complaining about referees.
It's a nice deflection, I guess. I do think we need to talk about Robert Andrich as well. I thought after he gave away that penalty, his response was incredible, and I actually thought from the penalty onwards he was my man of the match. The way he scores that, the equalizer, sort of making up for his mistake. And then his entire performance throughout the game, I thought, was incredibly outstanding. And for a guy who is such a late bloomer and is such a key player for Germany now, and is really became all that in his late 20s, and yet is seemingly making another step forward in his career in terms of what he can do technically, on top of already his very important, midfield abilities and defensive midfield abilities. And I think it's just incredibly outstanding, Stefan, what he did there. And I think too, he gave away the penalty. We both agreed it was soft. But then the reaction afterwards, I think, tells you everything you need to know about Robert Andrich and the sort of character he has and how important he is for this Leverkusen team.
Yeah, he's basically the clutch player, isn't he? He's that kind of player that Leverkusen can rely on. And I actually remember when he joined the club, which I think was the season before Xabi Alonso joined, if I'm not mistaken. So it would have been under Gerardo Siona, I believe. And at the time, if you remember, we were discussing what was going wrong at Leverkusen, and Andrich was one of the players that was brought in as a sort of remedy for what was seen as team of mercenaries, a team of very young players, very talented players, but no one really there who understood what was necessary or felt a degree of professional pride in trying to win games and and if they had to be won dirty, he'd be the guy to be happy to do it. So obviously he was brought in to be a certain character, and he's just grown into that. He's blossomed into this kind of captain figure, if you will, at Leverkusen, and we see this time and time again. He's the player who steps up. He's a player with really underrated technical skills. He's got a fantastic shot on him. And anyone who didn't catch this game, it's really worth watching the highlights, because Leverkusen's equaliser was this tremendous kind of one-touch football through the Frankfurt defence, which involved him basically playing a 1-2 with Martin Terrier. And we've seen this time and time and time again. He's already got 2 goals this season. He got 4 goals and 2 assists in the Bundesliga last season, even though he is kind of seen as this defensive enforcer. And that's why he got the call up for Germany, and that's why he continues to be a really important player for Leverkusen, which I think was so important in this game, because obviously they're missing Florian Wirtz, who's been the kind of match winner for them for this entire season. And to a lesser extent, I think Granit Xhaka is maybe kind of looking a little jaded. He's looking a little tired this season. Certainly understandable considering the gruesome kind of European championships he had with his nation. So Leverkusen needed someone to really step up in this game, and you were absolutely right. You made this point on the chat when we were watching the game with our subscribers. I thought it was a fantastic point. Since he gave away that penalty, which he would probably argue was a bit soft, but whatever. You're right, he was the best player on the pitch, and he really drove Leverkusen on to winning that game, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's been an outstanding leader in so many aspects, and really highlights you that, you should never give up on a player's career. Careers are not linear. For too long, especially in German football, we focus so much on the youth academies and players having to come up and go immediately to the top, or they're just being discarded. Germany's increasingly walking away from that model, which has really helped, I think, the national team as well, because there's lots of players like Andrich out there, right, who are now getting second chances. And yeah, I think he is the role model for that. He really shows it. I did a post, I wrote an article on Andrich for the Substack not that long ago, right, where I did speak to Simon Rolf, his sporting director, about this. And there's some great quotes about, why they think he's so important for them. And I know his abilities, how every time he moved to a bigger club, people were saying this is it. he's reached the glass ceiling and he just pushes through it. And I think that is very impressive. And I feel like he's making yet another step in his development this year. So yeah, it seems like sky is just the limit for him. And for Leverkusen, Stefan, their next few matches, this was a really, really important win for them, because up next is Brest in the Champions League, which a must win for them. Then comes Werder Bremen in the Bundesliga. Then comes Elversberg in the German Cup, and then on Friday, November 1st, they're playing Stuttgart. And Stuttgart has been one of those teams that has really been taking it to Leverkusen. Then there's Liverpool. Then there's Bochum. There's Heidenheim. In the Bundesliga, yes, the Stuttgart game aside, but this is going to be a stretch for them now where they really should pick up points consistently. They're only 3 points behind Bayern Munich, and I think they're actually setting themselves up in a situation now where the next big match after the Stuttgart game isn't until Dortmund on January 11th. In between is Freiburg, Augsburg, St. Pauli, Union Berlin, this Heidenheim as well. This is now a stretch where they really need to get on and get the maximum amount of points to stay in the title race.
Yeah, and I think what will probably encourage Xabi Alonso, not nearly as much maybe as picking up all 3 points, which is first and foremost the most important thing, but the way that his defence actually did relatively well in that game, aside from, as we said, the Hradecky hiccup in the last kind of minute of the match and the clumsy penalty, you'll probably look at this result and say, if you take the penalty out from Frankfurt, they only really allowed Frankfurt an XG of 0.75. They only had 2 shots on target throughout the entire game. And as if it had been that penalty, Leverkusen obviously would have got a clean sheet, which, by the way, would have been their first clean sheet of the season. And that is really the issue here that I think they'll have to work on going forward. Not only have they dropped silly points this season, but they've also conceded a lot of goals. Before the international break, they had Holstein Kiel, who scored 2 goals against them and took away a point. Bayern Munich obviously dominated that game against them. And you can see Leverkusen obviously did well to take a point from that. But, conceding 3 goals against Wolfsburg, conceding a goal against Hoffenheim, conceding 3 against Leipzig, conceding 2 against Gladbach. There's just no way that Leverkusen are going to be able to defend that league title if they keep shipping goals at that rate. And they're not going to go far in the Champions League either if they do the exact same thing either. So as you said, games like Werder Bremen, Brest, and the Pokal game as well against their league opposition. Then, of course, Stuttgart coming up on November 2nd as well. These are all games and opportunities for Alonso to probably sit down and really hammer out what that defence has done wrong so far and how to fix it. Because with all due respect to Werder Bremen and Brest, there are easier opposition than Leverkusen have already played this season. And that's where they have to start pulling together these clean sheets and putting together some consistency defensively, because I think that's where they've had these hiccups so far this season, and that's the area that they have to fix if they want to defend that league title.